So today's panel is it's basically technology. Is it making us mentally ill? It's a fascinating topic because, as we all know, technology pervades every aspect of our lives. Many of you who have kids or are millennials or who aren't millennials know how hard it can be to detach from all the devices and unplug every once in a while. But sometimes it goes far beyond that into more serious levels of addiction. And so on that note, let me introduce our three panelists today. First, we have Dr. George Nitzburg. He earned his Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Columbia University. He is an adjunct professor at Columbia University where he teaches a master's level class on how technological advances can affect our well-being and the role human dynamics play in creating successful technology. Then we have Dr. Julia Hormuz. She is a clinical and health psychologist and the director of the Health Behaviors Laboratory at the University at Albany, whose research interests include the psychology of human food choice and non-substance behavioral addictions, such as to online social networking and video game use. And then finally, we have Nichole Amesbury. She is the head of clinical development here at Talkspace and a therapist in practice. She holds a master's degree in science and mental health counseling from Nova Southeastern University in Florida, and she spent the last 4 years working with experts on best practices for alternative delivery of mental health care. So I guess we'll kick it off with you, Julia. In terms of addiction, in terms of online addiction, what is addiction? How do we define it? How do we identify it? It's obviously a lot harder to quantify when we're talking about a digital overdose as opposed to a drug overdose or some other substance. So what are the criteria or the signs that you look for?
Sure. So in substance addictions, we know that there's certain criteria that kind of cut across a lot of different diagnostic categories that we look for, and I think everybody's probably pretty familiar with those. So tolerance, using more and more over time to get the same effect, withdrawal, getting really irritable and angry when you can't have access to the substance. And so the approach that we've taken in looking at the addictive potential of use of some of these modern technologies that we've been talking about all day is pretty much the same thing. So looking at, are we seeing evidence for tolerance, or people spending more and more time on these applications, withdrawal, they're getting really irritable if there's somewhere where they don't have access, do we see cravings, and then also a level of impairment. So it's just keeping people from engaging in other valued activities, being effective at work, fulfilling responsibilities at home. So we've really taken that approach of translating diagnostic criteria that we typically use for substance addictions and then looking, does that apply in the domain of
right. So in terms of studying, you delve deep into food addictions. How does that? What parallels do you see between food addictions and online or technological?
Yeah. So it's taken me a while to really sort of draw those parallels, but I think the biggest thing that I see is more when I started to think about treatment and interventions that we can use to help problems related to excess use of these technologies, and it's really this problem of not being able to prescribe abstinence. So when it comes to alcohol addiction, cocaine addiction, even smoking, we know what the end goal is. The end goal is ideally to not use at all. With the eating disorders, which is sort of where I originally came from in my research, the challenge really is to normalize an everyday behavior. We all have to eat 3, 4, 5 times a day. How do we get people to eat in a way that isn't pathological, but just healthy and eating for nutrition, eating for substance? And I think the same thing is really the challenge with using social media, using email. It's not realistic in today's world to tell people you have to get off your phone entirely. Most of our jobs depend on being able to do that. So finding a way to normalize behavior that's really everyday and needed, I think, is the challenge.
And George, from a psychological standpoint, do you find in this case there's certain individuals more prone to this kind of addiction than others, whether it be, people talk about addictive personalities, people maybe with depression or some form of OCD might be more susceptible to falling into this?
So I do think that there's certain people who may have underlying predispositions that might make them more susceptible to things like video game overuse or social media overuse. If you've got tendencies towards obsessional thinking or compulsions, if you've got really a kind of maybe troubles with addiction in the past, things like that, you may also be prone to overusing things like social media. But I also think I don't necessarily know, this is an emerging field, and we may see that things are more addiction-like than they are addiction necessarily. We may not see cravings or withdrawal symptoms like shaking or things like that when you get off of Facebook.
Right, like clear-cut technique.
But if it is addiction-like in that respect, there is a point at which you say, are we splitting hairs? Because really, at the end of the day, if it starts impairing functioning to that level and you've got underlying conditions that may be driving it, it really comes down to kind of the same thing. So I do think that's interesting.
Definitely, and I know you've done some research with video game violence in particular. I know a lot of folks out there have kids who play video games or maybe play them themselves. How do you begin to identify whether that becomes too immersive for them?
Well, I think it's necessary to sort of look at whether it is supplanting what they would normally do otherwise, or whether it is something that's complementing what they do. So, there are so many games actually. When we were running the study, Grand Theft Auto 3 was the big game there, so it was many years ago. But the big thing was that was actually a playground phenomenon at that moment. So it would have been very odd to not be engaged in that. You would have been out of the loop with your other friends. That's very different from somebody who overuses and they start dropping out of their normal activities, or they start failing in school or doing poorly. So I think that's what you've got to sort of take into account.
Uses an alternate reality from the actual.
Where you're entering into a fantasy world and leaving something else.
Yeah. Understand. I'm a gamer myself, although I don't play a lot of first-person shooters, but I have played Grand Theft Auto. In terms of identifying the problem, Nicole, what is it about the online world of social networking that makes us feel like we constantly need to be plugged in? I mean, you're saying it goes beyond just, sort of fear of missing out or FOMO or image envy, and sometimes it becomes a much more personal time suck for certain individuals.
I think so. I think one of the things that keeps us connected is because as humans we want to connect and belong, and our relationships are in many aspects the most important part of our lives. And so one of the things that happens, of course, online is relationships are augmented, or you may even have a whole relationship online. So if you disconnect from, say, Facebook, you're basically disconnecting from however many friends you have, maybe your grandma, maybe, and you're not going to be able to share in the same way. And so, of course, this makes it very hard to pull away. And then if we feel any anxiety in our relationships, we're more likely to move towards that for reassurance and to try to figure out, what's happening here. And so we see this, for example, in someone who suffers a breakup. And they don't disconnect on social media, and so then they're compulsively checking and obsessing about what it is that their partner was doing, creeping, stalking, and it's hard to pull away, and it's hard to get over the heartbreak. So they do it as a reassurance for their anxiety and to feel connected, but then it's a double-edged sword.
Right. Let's sort of dig a little deeper and hone in on some of the adverse effects of technology. George, coming from a clinical psychologist standpoint, in terms of, you've got the notion of digital amnesia, which is kind of like you have so much information at your fingertips, you don't need to remember any of it anymore. Your recall deteriorates as a result of having all this information all the time. But beyond that, let's talk about how this constant influx of stimuli affects your emotional state, whether it's digital sort of ADD, you can be clicking on one thing, getting a suggested video, and then your ad pops up for those shoes you were looking at earlier, It's insane. So I guess on a subconscious level, what kind of adverse effects are we looking at?
I think that there's really an amazing effect of having this pervasive and just constant stream of especially social information coming at you, because oftentimes people who suffer from various forms of mental illness, what they'll have trouble with socializing, trouble processing social information, interpersonal difficulty. So, and that'll co-occur with symptoms that are happening. But, what's so interesting is, asking somebody to refrain from, let's say, internet surveillance, for example, or something like that, when they are someone prone to sort of interpersonal difficulty, and they have Facebook or another social media application at their fingertips, it's sort of like asking an alcoholic to stop drinking when they're living in a liquor store. There's just a constant stream
right there in front of you
of social information that can and at least if think about it, if 5% of that is taken the wrong way, so to speak, or it's seen in the wrong context because of old patterns or things like that, it can really throw someone off.
Right. So I guess, we've talked about the problem. How does one go about treating something like that? What's the solution? Julia, coming from the world of eating disorders, I guess, obviously you said total abstinence just doesn't seem possible or realistic. So what do you suggest?
I think for the most part, it's not really realistic for us to get off our phones. So what we're really looking at a lot in my lab is kind of the underlying mechanisms, right? So what are risk factors that might make some people more vulnerable to develop problems related to some of these technologies? And one of the things that we've really focused in on that may provide a target for treatment is what we call emotion regulation deficit. So this idea that basically all of these applications, all these behaviors really serve to distract from negative emotions. We don't like to sit with boredom or sadness or anger. And so getting on Facebook, getting on Twitter is sort of a quick way to get away from that. And so I think one of the areas where interventions really are useful is to think about, can we teach more adaptive ways of dealing with the negative affect so people don't develop this reliance on these other kind of ways of distracting from it. And then so getting to the point of that we talked about earlier, what are some of the and negative effects of having this constant stream. So thinking about this earlier, the other panel was talking about mental illness in relation to social media uses. So I think we've forgotten the value of sort of sitting with these uncomfortable emotions, right? So several decades ago, that was a pretty normal thing to wait for the bus and just be bored for a bit.
Right.
And I think there's value in those times, right? Where I think it leads to a lot of creative thinking and innovative thinking, and sort of not constantly being distracted, not constantly being plugged into something else. And I think we've really taken that away from ourselves to really have those moments where, we go inside and we introspect and we kind of see what's going on. So
yeah.
I think that
we're so easily distracted now with all the multitasking going on. And George, I guess, what would you propose as a solution to this problem? I mean, you think identifying it involves sort of taking it away temporarily and then seeing if you have withdrawal symptoms. So how do you go about combating that?
So I mean, that's sort of my recommendation is that, if you are using something a lot and you're starting to have a glimmer that maybe, I don't know, could this be a problem? If you just take a week off and you say, okay, I'm gonna take a week off of this, I mean, what happens? Is it really an impossible task? And is the reason behind that? I would agree, emotion regulation is so key, it's the key underlying thing. Are you having trouble with regulating emotions? Are you having trouble sitting in distress all of a sudden because you took this internet platform away or this digital tool away? Right. And then if you reintroduce it, does that cause an incredible amount of relief? And then that's when you start maybe starting to be saying to yourself, I might need to get some help with this. And
then I'm too dependent on this.
Yeah.
Nicole, I know you've worked specifically on programs to treat social media dependency. So how would you suggest dealing with this problem overall? I mean, social media is out there constantly. The idea that you can treat the dependency on it is kind of unfathomable.
I think you really have to spend some time looking at the person, the individual, and how they're using it. There can be many different ways to be overly dependent. And if we talk about emotional regulation, it actually can be beneficial in some ways to be able to express yourself, online through YouTube and sharing photos and stuff when it's done in a way that's like really pro-social. Unfortunately, it's not a lot of times, and there's bullying and things like that. So I think you have to look at somebody's use and why. And then I think the most important thing is how can we get people to understand that we're using the technology isn't using us. So we're not just being funneled mindlessly through a website to click, but that any interactions we have online, we recognize that they can be meaningful. And really education's a lot about that. Somebody had also mentioned earlier about schools needing maybe some education on that, and that'd be a good start. That'd be one place you could pick it up. But each person kind of needs to think about their use and why.
Right. On the other hand, technology, it's sort of a double-edged sword. It certainly can help us in a lot of ways. How do we use that to? What are some positive influences technology has in terms of treating, maybe mental illness or any of these disorders we're talking about?
Well, yeah, I know I can answer this really well because that's what we do at Talkspace is have relationships with people online. You know?
Recognize there's somebody on the other side of that screen.
Yeah, and I think what's a big thing of what's happened is we've created this, nomenclature culture where we say, you know, a user, I'm going to block him, I'm going to friend him. And we've changed like our idea of what sharing is, what liking something is. And we're talking at people and not with them in a lot of instances. So we need to figure out how we can turn that around a little bit. Like for example, our community of therapists talks, and when we share, we're pretty mindful not to say end user, even though we all know it's a startup term. We could be like, oh, so-and-so the end user, because there's something about end user that doesn't, somehow the therapist doesn't sound as human.
Right.
So we say person or client, you know, and we try to be very careful and mindful about that. We still, you know, sometimes just talking fast, you know, say user, but I think it's important how we use our words.
So I guess on that note, what in your opinions constitutes a healthy relationship with technology, when we're, you know, you can use it effectively, not let it use you, as you said, without allowing it to take over your lives? George?
Well, I think that really, I tend to think that, you know, technology use has to be, as I said before, it has to complement your life. So, you know, I often think of it as ultimately these are tools for human connection, right? And at the end of the day, that's what we want, and that's what's healthy, is to have human connections and to be heard. So often on these platforms, what we end up doing is there's talking, there's kind of screaming into the void or talking to the void, but there's not a lot of being heard, or if there is being heard, we know that now that norms are to be kind of overly positive in whatever you say. So you're only hearing one half of the picture of someone's life. You're hearing what's going on that's very positive in their life, but not the challenges they're undergoing. So I think the goal really is to, you know, find the aspects of digital platforms that are pro-social, that allow you to express yourself in a way that others are hearing you. So, you know, maybe perhaps instead of posting to the news feed of a social media platform, to direct message, where we know that people can and do post negative things as well as positive things.
Have more of a dialogue.
Yeah, and have a dialogue and have human connection.
Right.
And I think we see this more too with the increase of asynchronous voice message and different ways of sharing, because if you just post something on a platform, you get a little emoticon or something to click that says that I heard you. But there's a lot of other ways that people can express that they've heard someone, so.
Sure. And Julia?
Well, this has been a very eye-opening day for me, because I feel like I have a very biased view on these things, because obviously I mostly focus on problems related to excess use of things like social media. And so really thinking about some of the upsides to having this technology available to us. So a couple things that came to mind for me is, again, so thinking about more my work in eating disorders, and I know this was a topic of conversation at the earlier panels, of exposure, you know, to all these idealized images of women and men, fits, you know, inspiration, all that kind of stuff, and the influence it has on our mental health. But I think there's a flip side to that too, in that we now also have much more access to regular people posting images on, you know, their social media sites that maybe back in the day when we're all just flipping through magazines, we didn't have that kind of access. And there's, you know, just like there's literature showing that exposure to these idealized forms really lowers satisfaction, exposure to more realistic shapes and figures of people actually has the opposite effect. So I think there can be a positive in that. And then another sort of aspect kind of tying into some of the work that we've done, again, this role of emotional regulation deficits, and you mentioned the addictive personality earlier, which is a very controversial construct, but we're sort of getting back to this idea, because what we actually see is in the people that we survey who report problematic use of social media, they're actually also people who report a lot of problems with the more traditional substances, so they're more likely to be problem drinkers. So it seems that the risk factors are the same, that they're either going on Facebook to distract from depression, or they're getting a drink to distract from depression. But then at the same time, maybe social media is a way for us to reach a population of people who perhaps are struggling with alcohol or struggling with drugs, who would never come in and see a therapist, but they might be more responsive to interventions that we deliver through those platforms. So I think that might be another kind of upside.
Spread awareness, absolutely.
Also, this is just such an interesting point, because I think when you look at addiction, one of the things you look at is it a progressive problem? Does it get worse over time? And of course, that's kind of hard to gauge when you think about the internet, because the whole internet and all of our online time has expanded over the years. But one of the ways that we can tell when someone's doing a little bit better when we're caring for somebody online is that we see patterns of how much they communicate with us change over time, and sometimes it's more when they're you know, in a difficult place. But overall, I think in time we see them communicate with us less. when they don't need us as much. And so it's kind of interesting how we foster either dependence or interdependence with technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I think on a basic level, technology's infiltrated our lives so much that it becomes sort of a way for us to forget how to interact with people in real life. I mean, even now we have apps to order Starbucks way ahead of time. We don't have to interact with anybody. We don't have to talk to the barista. We don't, and people who don't have their coffee probably don't want to talk to people that early in the morning. I mean, I can relate. But I think it's important to just force people to just go outside and interact with people in the real world. Something as simple as that could be useful for younger kids, at least. Get them off the iPad. In terms of, I guess, we live in a new age of technology where some of the old paradigms in healthcare and treatment are sort of antiquated and outdated. They don't apply anymore. So how can technology be used effectively for therapy? I mean, how is it disrupting the space? Where does it fit in? How do we integrate it into the future of therapy, to bring it back to the title of this conference? Yeah, George.
Well, I mean, when you look at the best statistics we have, which is the National Comorbidity Survey, really about 30% of people at any given time have mental health conditions and are not seeking help for them. Okay. 40% of people, or excuse me, I'm sorry, I reversed that. About 30% of people get mental health help, and about 70% of people don't. That number is about 40% if you include the primary care physician or a pastor or someone who may or may not be trained. So this is an incredibly, potentially disruptive and potentially valuable source for therapeutic help. And really the question that, is how do we best find the number of sessions, the things like that, the factors that make that the most effective possible.
And give people more access to it who may not normally have it. Because, I mean, I was hearing earlier, wait lists can be up to 3 months long.
Yeah, they can be up to 3 months long, and that's just, that's in speaking about in the United States, and gets even more drastic when you're talking about a second or third world country. And then, it's really, so it's really an issue that is pretty pervasive.
Yeah, and in terms of, I guess, what we call telepsychiatry, telemental health, telebehavioral health, whatever you want to call it, online psychiatry, some critics will say, okay, but you're missing some of the valuable nonverbal mannerisms or clues that your patient is giving you based on their voice or body language. How would you respond to those critics?
So I think that, there's no doubt there's the loss of the AV signal, but I think that there's been an underestimation, a pretty consistent underestimation of how people are able to use whatever format of communication that they're given with other people to form connections and to really, I mean, it's amazing to me that on AIM and on Facebook, and these norms develop. People develop ways of sort of seeing how each other interact. I mean, this is what we've evolved to do, is to be social animals and to see all these little social cues. And even when we're at perhaps a disadvantage, or quote unquote, where we don't have AV signals, audiovisual signals, or cues, we can still manage to find these little things in whatever platform we're using, because this is a highly evolved sense.
Right.
At the end of the day.
I was thinking of something a client of mine said, because we hear this, something's missing. Someone had written an article that questioned this about what we did, and my patient happened to read it, and he said, look, and he couldn't get help for a long time, and he finally was able to get help. He said, look, if I'm crying, I'm going to tell you I'm crying. It's not like he was trying to keep it a secret from me. He needed help, and he was in pain. And I think, when people can see, a therapist, when they get discharged from the emergency room after being getting help for mental illness, and then have to wait, 3 weeks to see a therapist. Then when they finally do get to see a therapist and get the intake done, they see maybe a therapist once a month, maybe they do a psych med check once every 3 months. And I think to say that we're missing something, it'd be a really great therapist that is overburdened with the caseload, that sees a patient once a month, and they're not missing something. So the fact that online you can have consistent care and be a little bit of their in vivo experience in daily life is, it really it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, the pros outweigh the cons in this.
And I think another piece to that is as you broaden access, hopefully you also reduce stigma. If it becomes a more accessible, kind of matter-of-fact thing for people to have access to a therapist and work with a therapist, hopefully some of the stigma that was brought up earlier is reduced at the same time as well.
And I guess what can we do, in everyday, life to reduce that stigma? Because there's so much of it still out there in terms of just being associated with a therapist or going toward a therapist's office, or anything like that. Yeah. How can we kind of alleviate that tension?
I mean, I think everybody could just be more authentic online in general, not be who you are is the easiest thing to say.
And again, we talked a little bit about sort of the distance, right, from talking to somebody face to face and then putting something out on a blog or on Facebook. I think people might be more willing to talk about their struggles with mental health on a blog than they are face to face with friends, and sort of putting it out there and showing people that this is something that is affecting quite a few of us. I think there's an advantage to that, and having a forum for doing that maybe more openly, more willingly.
Right.
Yeah, I think there is an aspect of this that really is about the limitations of discretion for physical therapy that we haven't seen until there's been these other options. In a small rural community, you're not really going to see the therapist, you're going to see Bob, right?
Yeah.
And Bob lives across the street from Susan, and if you go into Bob's office, Susan sees you, and it's a small town, and rumors spread quick, et cetera. So I mean, I think there's the discretion available in accessing a platform that's online does have that benefit.
Right. I guess we still have a little bit of time left before Q&A, but we can open it up to it early. If any of the audience members has questions for the panelists here? Yes. We have a microphone somewhere?
I can be loud otherwise too. I'm Angie, I'm a therapist and sales team member. Can you just talk a little about online dating, how that impacts the mental health stuff? I notice a lot of folks who I work with that are on maybe 15 different online dating sites, and it's this really incessant craving of attention and affirmation that they're getting from that feedback.
So I guess for the people who don't have mic who are streaming, this was a question about online dating and how that might make us ill. And so I can certainly speak to that. The online dating is really about selective self-presentation is the research term that's used for it, meaning taking the best possible picture and accentuating the best possible qualities of yourself. It's not unlike what's happening in sort of the norms on social media to only post the positive information. And it is in some ways remarkable that people do accentuate all their positive features and take these photos when not a week later do they meet the person on a date. And so what the research has shown is that contrary to what you might expect, not only are they kind of hurt that the other person might bring it up, but they're very angry that the other person did that as well,
Right.
because they're both doing it.
Right.
So it's this really ironic thing that I think can contribute to the sense of poor self-worth, poor body image in some cases, but it's definitely social comparison where you feel like other people are living happier, better lives than you are, or who look better, feel better than you do. But it's all this best foot forward.
Right.
Well, as much as I'd like to believe that all the Tinder and Match.com and all the sites want people to fall in love with one person and stay in love and have a great intimate relationship forever, I happen to think they probably want to make money too. And so I think looking at the design of those type of sites is something that and for people to be more savvy consumers of those sites would be good, because even though you start talking to one person, you may be approached by way more than you would if you were not on a site. And it gives you this idea of choices that you have much more choice maybe than you actually do. And so I see a lot of people trapped in the choice process of like, do I stay or go? Because maybe I could do better over here, or maybe this or that. And they're just inundated with having to make a choice when they go on to one of these.
Decision
Do I
fatigue.
slide, what do I do? And so I think looking at the funnel and the design as a savvy consumer is a good idea.
The online dating is, I think, a fascinating area because it's so prevalent and yet we have so little data on it. And so we always included some questions on online dating in our surveys, and something we noticed is we actually asked people for, about their motives for being on these applications. And a very large number of our respondents, primarily undergraduate students, said that they are on these dating sites with no intention of finding a relationship. And so what we're looking at is really, again, are these applications serving just the purpose of having something to do as you're waiting for the bus, or you're in a particularly boring class and you're swiping left, swiping right.
It's like a
just
game.
another one of those things. And something we talked about earlier and that hasn't come up yet is sort of this thought about how do these problematic behaviors actually develop over time. And so I think the analogy that's most useful to me in thinking about it is sort of the gambling, right? Where what keeps people coming back and placing bets is the next time it might pay off. And so with a lot of these applications, like the next time you go on, somebody else may have looked at your profile, or somebody may have liked something, or somebody may have looked at something and left a comment. And I think that's really ultimately a lot of times what has people coming back, and not necessarily the intention of, I'm going to find the love of my life.
Right.
Well, and it's concerning because the CDC did research too on rates of sexually transmitted diseases and things like this, and app use, and correlated them. And so they do find that in places where certain platforms are used more, they do have an increase in sexually transmitted diseases and infections.
Wow. Yes, this gentleman right here.
Hi, Steve Bisson. I'm a Talkspace therapist. I like the idea of pro-social use of social media, but I didn't hear a lot of examples that how we can use it, so I was wondering if anybody had good examples that they can share.
Sure. So, I mean, I can speak to, I know that in video games, there are many video games that they don't get a lot of public attention that are, I mean, there's a whole new field developing of serious games and games that are out to solve pro-social sort of issues. But even moving beyond the sort of serious games movement that's trying to take game mechanics and put them towards social good, there are games that are nonviolent and that promote sort of a multiplayer, what you'd think of in child development terms as parallel play, that you engage in a shared activity, but you're not directly interacting with each other. These are perfectly reasonable forms of connection for people, and there's ways in which we are creating a more connected world where, when in the past, if you left high school, if you left college, that was it for those friends. I mean, you did not keep in touch with those people, and now you can maintain connections across long distances. So there's lots of social ways to do that, and you can do it even around a shared interest, especially, for example, a game that's online or things like that. But then there's these other negative possibilities, which of course receive the most attention because we want to find solutions for them.
I think if everybody took a little bit of time when they see something that a friend of theirs shared, and thought about a way to deepen the conversation or write a thoughtful response instead of just clicking like and going on a day. If you took a little bit of more quality time to respond to people thoughtfully, really it's a simple solution, and if we weren't maybe bombarded with, it's the amount of information too, because I think what pulls us just to click like and move on to the next one is because it's so much. If you scroll through Instagram, for instance, it's like photo after photo after photo.
You're inundated.
So nobody really stops to take the time to say something, really thoughtful.
Yeah, I agree. That's why all these new interactions like and haha on Facebook, I feel like they're a bit superficial, and I don't think they add anything to the conversation. But anyway, any other questions from the audience?
Hello. Howard
Hello.
again.
How are you?
This time standing up. So the video game question, I have a big interest in that just because I play video games, my kids play video games, and thinking about sort of the sandbox style of video games where you got a bunch of players from different servers, kind of all in the same virtual room, if you will, and that's a great place for bullying to happen and for people to sort of try out whatever they would typically use, like keyboard courage, just, say nasty things to someone, just being like a provocative bully, like, oh, I'll say something nasty, and if you bully me, like, I'm the victim. What do you think is the social responsibility of the video game community or video game developers or console or the people who kind of manage those things to make sure that kids aren't practicing that, because they have essentially unrestricted access to buy these mature games? I don't even know. I mean, they put the ratings on there. I don't even know if it matters anymore because they can just buy it. But I've had to sit next to my now 12-year-old and coach him on how to cooperate with other people. Right. He was being nasty, I'll just say that. So I had to coach him about that, but I don't know if all parents are gonna sit there next to their kid as they're walking, through a game to do that. So I just wanted to know, what is the bigger responsibility to make sure that kids aren't practicing cyberbullying?
Well, I think that cyberbullying doesn't just have to take place in the context of, I would just say that it doesn't have to take place in the context necessarily of video gaming. It takes place in a lot of different social media contexts. That being said, I do see what you're saying, that whenever you're playing a game, it can become monkey in the middle, or it can become, an exclusionary way to exclude or bully. I do think that the way that you design any of these tools, in my view, they're all sorts of games and tools, can facilitate that sort of, or can really prohibit it. And there needs to be sort of a psychological mindedness to the design of these products. It's part of why I research what I research and I teach about what I teach about. Because I think that it is really interesting that, there is not more sort of psychologically minded or psychological consultation when implementing the design and the user interfaces of products in general. I mean, I think, of course, products that deliver therapy services are obviously psychologically minded in their mission in general. But there are many websites and things like that I think they are made so that they draw you in. I think it's part of a small piece of this behavioral addiction that we've been talking about, is that user interfaces are designed with the inherent goal of keeping you coming back. And so they're going to be designed not as, I'm not saying they're slot machines in any way, but they're not like that level, but they have elements where they want you to click again. They want you to refresh. And Facebook is a prime example where actually you have a fixed ratio reinforcement schedule and a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. You click and you get something, but you don't know what it is. Could be social information that's good, bad, etc. So it can be quite habit forming, is what I would say.
And I think you sort of mentioned the answer as part of your question, which is sort of the importance of appropriate modeling, right? And I think that's really the danger of spending so much time on these applications, especially now with generations that, unlike me, don't remember a time when there wasn't Facebook and there weren't cell phones and there wasn't text messaging. And so I think that's partly the concern of spending so much time on these applications, is it's at the expense of face-to-face sort of human interaction, which gives you that feedback of, oh, you can't actually talk to people like this and expect them to be okay with it. And so I think that's really the importance of the balance and still having that face-to-face contact, which comes with sort of feedback on, how people actually respond to the things that you're saying, which you don't necessarily get online.
Well, I mean, I think everybody needs to take some responsibility, just a little bit. We're all in it together, There's end users, if you say, there's developers, we're all using this, and we can't say, okay, well, one person has to do this, but then the parents don't have to watch the kids, or, everybody needs to take some responsibility.
Right.
And the technology has moved faster than I think we've really thought about it.
This gentleman back here.
I think I agree with Nicole. I think as a parent, I had to realize that I think the problem comes from parents and not from kids. If from a very early age you were teaching your kids how to behave in the courtyard or how to ride a bicycle because you've done that before, then the problem wouldn't be here. But then when they're 10 years old and suddenly you put a phone in their hands and you don't tell them how to use it, or because you didn't know how to use it, you'd never used Snapchat or Instagram before. So if you don't train them, then they won't know. And you're just like throwing them out there as like, put them on a bicycle on the motorway and go ride. And they might kill themselves. So you, as a parent, I think we need to take responsibility for actually playing those games and using Snapchat, even if you don't like it, but at least you to have the curiosity of using it.
It'd be great if there was like a tutorial for parents, like what is Snapchat? And like, it kind of just give me, because you go on the iTunes and you look and you see what it's about a little bit, but it doesn't give you the full picture sometimes. It'd be nice. It could be like a whole series if somebody wants to do that.
I certainly have sympathy for parents who don't, these new tools come out, these new frameworks come out, and they don't necessarily know what they are. They just know this weird new name is popping up in their children's vocabulary. But yes, I mean, it can be very helpful if you model how to properly use it.
Or just go in and familiarize yourself with the privacy settings too of things like Instagram. You don't want like tons of strangers liking your children's pictures necessarily. Yes, this gentleman here. You have a microphone?
Hello, I'm a student in clinical psychology, a graduate student. This question is for Ms. Amesbury in regards to Talkspace. And say we see the advent of digital dependencies within this digital generation. And given that Talkspace is a digital medium for therapy, is that going to be counterproductive in any way? How you go about treating virtual or digital dependency?
That's a really great question. I think people have heard the expression, sometimes you have to fight the devil with a demon or something like that. You think, well, isn't this what you are? But no. One of the huge tenet in therapy is you have to meet the client where they are. And we're not able to do that in so many instances around the world because there just isn't access to healthcare. That's one layer of it. Another layer is people are going to reach out however is most natural and comfortable for them. There's a lot of people that would never reach out otherwise for a variety of reasons, some of them even very practical, like they don't have transportation. And so we have to think about, well, if we do meet people where they are in this, and they do have some kind of a dependency problem, what do we do with it? And that's I'm going to say the secret is in the sauce. The secret's in the therapy. We don't interact with people online as if it was Facebook. The therapists are trained, of course, and so the interactions we have and how we've designed the site and how it's approached is different. And so it actually is a good modeling of how to be online in a way that helps people. It can often show people, wow, I can text somebody and get a completely different response than I would have ever expected in any other platform. An understanding one, a compassionate one. And so once people see that they can have this type of relationship online, they could have that type of relationship online with anyone. And so it's a really cool way to do it, actually. Does that answer your question? Cool.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much to our three panelists. It was a great conversation for joining us today, and thank you all for coming.